Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. My name is Shannon Fern, and I'll be your moderator today. I do have a couple of housekeeping items to go over before we get started. First, we are recording today's webinar, and it will be available starting tomorrow morning on both LiveWell Colorado's website and Denver Urban Gardens website. So if you'd like to review it or send it to your colleagues, please check one of those two websites tomorrow morning. And second, we will be taking questions during the webinar today. If you do have questions as we're going along, you should see a questions tab on your screen. Just go ahead and type your questions into the questions tab. And as we have time as we're going along, we'll go ahead and answer those questions. We'll also have time at the end of the webinar if we're not able to get to your question during the webinar. In addition, we do have the capability to answer your questions if you'd like to ask them out loud or if you'd like to spend a little bit more time talking. In order to be able to do that, what you'll actually need to do is find the audio tab in the control panel on your screen. Instead of microphone and speakers, select Use Telephone and then call into the webinar using the telephone number, access code, and audio PIN provided. You will be muted when you call in. If you would like to ask a question out loud, on your control panel, you'll see a place where you can raise your hand. Just click on that button and raise your hand, and we'll call on you and get your question answered. So with no further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Leslie Levine.
Hi there. This is Leslie with LiveWell Colorado. I'm the Technical Assistance Coordinator for our Community Investment Program. So thank you to everybody for joining us today. So I want to kind of set the stage for this webinar. We have two wonderful staff from Denver Urban Gardens that will be speaking today. And they are extremely successful and thus very popular as an organization to go to and ask a lot of questions about community and school gardens and everything related to that. And so we are hoping that by providing some webinars, which will be recorded and posted on both the LiveWell Colorado and the Denver Urban Gardens websites, that folks can listen to these and be able to narrow down their questions for Denver Urban Gardens so that they can really maximize the time that they dedicate to working with those outside of the Denver area on their garden initiatives. And so some people might know that Denver Urban Gardens was a LiveWell community for a number of years, and that's how they are part of our circle, part of our peer network. We have Michael Buckano, who is the Executive Director for Denver Urban Gardens. He will be speaking today, as well as Shannon Spurlock, who is the former coordinator for the LiveWell initiative that Denver Urban Gardens had. And so now I'd like to turn it over to Doug.
Good morning. This is Michael. So our topic today is all about the different kinds of community gardens that are out there and maybe which model that you might want to choose. But before we get to that point, there are a few things that are completely common to all community gardens that are really important things to consider. And the first one being the readiness of the community. And assessing that is critical to every community garden. We as an organization have about 115 community gardens that we support and have built over the years. I myself have been doing this for about 15, 16 years now, and we've gotten a pretty good feel for how to go about assessing the readiness of a community for a project to begin. But it's still kind of an art to it. There are a few things that are pretty critical, though. And so I thought I'd go over those briefly. The most important thing in many ways is that there's a critical mass of committed participants, meaning we have the project coming to us from within the community, and that there's more than just 2 or 3 people. That always smells of a pet project, a neighborhood that's concerned about a lot that needs to get cleaned up, and they think a community garden might be that perfect solution. A temporary project that a property owner or a neighborhood thinks might solve an eyesore until it gets developed on. All of these reasons are not very good ones for a community garden. the most compelling is always a committed critical mass of participants that really want to garden, that have a need to garden, and that see the purpose in it within their community. So that's number one. And we have yet to build a community garden in Denver that doesn't have this in place. In fact, every community garden that's come to us has been initiated from within the community. It's never been that we think that a garden needs to go in a certain neighborhood and we initiate the process ourselves. It's always a community coming to us. Important as well to that critical mass is that there is political support for the garden in the neighborhood. The city council office is supportive of it. Of course, where you're selecting to locate the garden, the landowner obviously needs to be in complete support. Agency support for the garden is as important in some ways in terms of agencies that you're going to need to access to get the garden infrastructure in place. The water department, for instance, you want to make sure that the garden fits within the city's zoning or the county's zoning that is in place for a particular site. Neighborhood associations are just as important. That the leadership within the community, and sometimes those folks are not obvious, and so you need to dig into your community a little bit to decide who those leaders are and make sure that they're supportive of the project. Once you get a sense that there's a critical mass of folks and that there's a lot of broad support for the project, it's the next step in some ways is to develop a general consensus on the need for the garden. And a lot of times gardens have multiple needs. We do have gardens that seem singularly minded, but most of the time there's multiple needs that are being addressed by a garden. And to try and get those out on the table and what people's the initial set of participants, what their desires are for the purpose of the garden is really important to get on the table. It can be a myriad of things from healthy food access, in a really impoverished community, to a garden that also is going to provide some education. Sometimes we've had gardens develop that are all about building community in a neighborhood that has some strife. Gardens can provide a therapeutic benefit from the horticultural background. A garden can become a very critical focus in a neighborhood physically, and that's one of the purposes a lot of folks will point to as to why they're starting a garden. And in most cases, it's all of the above. But it's, as I mentioned, it's very important to get all of those possible purposes out on the table so that everyone comes to a general consensus that this is why this project is happening and this is what we care about. Just as important to understanding and developing the social, people-based part of the garden is, of course, the physical part of the garden. And we typically look at those two major aspects of a community garden as just as important as each other and obviously very interconnected. When we're talking about readiness for a site, it's pretty important to pick the right location within a community. Often the group that's starting a garden and is seeking our assistance is coming to us with a couple sites already identified or a site identified, and they are sort of hopeful that that's the one that will be selected. There has been occasion where we've selected another site because the site that they picked was not sustainable from some land ownership standpoint. And that's number one in a lot of ways is the ownership of the property that is any vacant property around the area that they're looking for a garden or an actual site that they've selected. The ownership is pretty critical. And as an organization, we, over the years, have really leaned away from privately owned property for the very reason that most privately owned property is being speculated on, and the ownership can change hands, and eventually the garden will be sold and built on in some fashion. And so projects that are on those kind of properties are actually temporary and in many cases can really injure a community that has invested in that project themselves with all their sort of blood, sweat, and tears. And to have that rug pulled out from under them is really a difficult thing. So we look for institutionalized and publicly owned properties in which the owner of the property or the agency that owns it is like-minded about the purpose of it for a garden, and in fact programs the garden into that land ownership and that land planning that they're doing. The location is awfully important as well as the ownership from a sustainability standpoint. We try and avoid projects that are tucked back in corners of properties. They're not visible. We look for a very, very centralized, highly visible site that becomes part of the community and it becomes part of their everyday landscape. In addition to that, we're also looking at the health of the site, of course, which often it might involve a phase 1 property assessment to make sure that the site is clean enough for a garden. When I say clean enough, in the city here in Denver, most of the gardens we build are on sites that do not have any hazardous material on them or have not had that, but they also don't have, very healthy soil from an urban standpoint. So a lot of soil building has to happen. But we're looking initially at that, the health, to make sure that there's no hazards. So now I'm going to turn the discussion over to Shannon from my office to talk about some additional considerations when starting a garden that are common to most all gardens.
Good morning. So we are going to start off by talking about something called Asset-Based Community Development, ABCD. Often when people are looking at working with a community, especially if the community is lower income, the community is looked at from a deficit standpoint rather than being rich in other resources that may not be financial. So once you've gone through that community readiness assessment and you've decided that your group is good to go, you have broad-based support, sustainable site, working with the people who are committed to really understand the resources that are in your community is very important. It's a process that looks at what resources exist, something that people may already have access to in their daily lives. And so each person, when we look at working with people, we know that everyone has a talent to contribute, or if it's not their time, but this is part of that process and looking at the contributions people bring. One way to look at that, there's a worksheet here, and if anyone's interested, I can send a blank one, but it's mapping reciprocal partnerships. And if you're digging in and looking at your local community resources, it's great to look at the resources, the groups around you. Whether artists and community gardens are closely tied together, whether it's a youth center, food banks, schools, and find out how the two complement each other and find out how the two can be beneficial to each other. The resources that a bank may offer differ from a youth center. If you're looking for the skills or someone with time, you might find someone with time available from a retirement center. It's kind of funny, they offer, this example has Ladies Bridge Club on it, but any sort of informal kind of social gathering of people that come together. People connected to a church might have time that they contribute. Local hospitals might have a nutritionist on staff that they can offer complimentary programming around health in the community garden. So asset-based community development, looking at your community members who are gardening and the surrounding community to find out where the strengths are before you move into that planning stage so you know what your foundation looks like. I'm going to turn it back over to Michael, and we're going to jump into the different examples of community gardening models.
So and the first one we talked about is the traditional community garden, which is one in which land is divided up and folks take their plot and garden it, as an individual or friends or as a family, and then they share community-based tasks with the rest of the gardeners. We have most of our gardens are in that sort of format, but we do have gardens that actually will share plots, meaning that they will, one person in one section of the garden will be growing something specific, and then they'll be growing something else in another section of the garden, and they'll tend it collectively and share. And so those are the typical community garden models that we work with. And each of those has some very standard things that need to be talked about in making them successful. As a group, they'll need to develop some guidelines around organizing and very basic behaviors in the garden that are that make sense to the group. They'll have to decide if there's some special projects that they want to engage in. For instance, a beehive here in Denver is one that gardens decide on whether they're going to allow a beekeeper, and we have a pretty sizable policy around that helps educate folks on bees and how to manage them and how best to have that kind of project function successfully in the garden. There's all kinds of guidelines around visitation and pets in the garden, and the guidelines are awfully critical for gardeners to collectively come up with and decide on, so that ultimately they are, each day they enter the garden, they're geared towards the success of the garden as a whole rather than their needs. The worst thing that can happen is for gardeners to become to develop a sense of privilege in the garden, and that folks are serving them rather than them serving each other. So the guidelines and setting plot fees are awfully important to come through the community garden leadership and be a decision that's made by all. Other things to think about: formal donation programs and so forth come out of gardens as they mature. But again, it's mostly critical to involve all members in this decision process with a typical or traditional community garden. We also have other models that we work with in community gardens based, again, on the population that we're working with that is desiring a garden and their particular needs. A school garden, of course, has a whole bunch of different needs than a traditional community garden. However, we still believe that a school garden is most successful when it's also a community garden, in that community members are supporting the work and the connections to the school. They're there in the major part of the growing season when kids are typically out of school. They bridge that gap, and they provide this potential mentorship team for teachers to work within the school. There's other considerations at school gardens that are different than in a traditional community garden that's just in a block somewhere, that we've developed over the years around the issue of background checks for gardeners, given that schools require that with their volunteers, and other issues that we can get into if folks are interested in talking about school gardens specifically. We also tend to have some differences between a traditional community garden and a church garden. Gardens on church property, which we've gotten into some recently because there are so many churches in this community in the Denver metro area that have excess property and are looking to give back to their communities by allowing the use of that property for community gardens. So it starts to get into the area of sustainability of the property. And we do the same thing with schools. We will sit down with the administration of the church or the school district, and we'll look at the master plan for the property to make sure that a garden that gets installed doesn't have to be moved and doesn't have to be eliminated at some point based on, you know, a growth change in the church, a parking lot need at the school. So we're looking for a sustainable location within the property of both of those kinds of sites. And the same thing goes for gardens that we build on housing authority property. We want to make sure that on all three those types of properties and agency partners that the garden is programmed into the use of that property, and it's not a temporary use. It's something that they see as a long-term element. It's located in a central location that makes sense within the open space of those sites, and becomes part of the culture of those properties and the folks that live there. We also have some very special gardens that have a different model, in that the folks that we're serving have very, very special needs in some way, and the garden has to accommodate those needs. We have a garden at an organization called the Atlantis Communities here in the Baker neighborhood of Denver, in which the organization's facility is a day center for folks with severe emotional and physical challenges, and the garden's purpose is, in a lot of ways, primarily horticulture therapy, and secondarily is to infuse some healthy produce into the lunch system that they provide these folks. And so the considerations around these kind of gardens typically require that we have an agency partner that's on the ground at the site that is also helping with the programming work and the organizing of the garden, again, allowing folks to take on as much as they can based on their abilities, because that's awfully critical to their development. But there is a support need from organization on the ground typically. We also have gardens at senior housing projects or senior housing towers, in which it's a community garden, and the community is made up of the residents of that building. And so typically the garden is not open to outside residents if it's full with the seniors from the building. And we also are working currently with some juvenile programs in which we have a garden that we're going to be developing inside a detention center, in which obviously there'll be some special needs with volunteers coming in and having background checks and being able to work with the youth. The concept there is that the garden is kind of a way station for kids that show an aptitude and an interest in it, because they'll only be there for several weeks at a time, and the goal would be to reconnect them to an existing community garden in a nearby neighborhood. And so, the gardens in that context are going to be a lot more about educating and connecting the kids to the active hands-on work in a garden, and to engage them and to maybe spark something in their life that creates a change. And so a lot of these specialty gardens that we work with strictly are the physical elements in the garden, and the programming support and education support we provide is based on the needs of that particular population. So we'd like to open this up now for questions. A lot easier in some ways to answer specific needs that people might have, and talk about school gardens, for instance, further if you folks so desire.
And just a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, you can do that in two ways. You can either type it into the questions tab on your screen, or if you'd like to ask your question out loud, please make sure that you have selected Use Telephone on your audio tab and called in using the phone number and audio pin provided. And then you can go ahead and raise your hand and we'll call on you. And just a reminder for everyone, this webinar has been recorded and it will be available on LiveWell Colorado's website as well as Denver Urban Gardens website. Just give it a few minutes for questions to come in. All right, we do have a question from Sean Clark. Can you give us some ideas on how to determine if we have that critical mass that you talked about?
I knew I'd get this question. I always get this question. You know, typically, and I hate to put a number on it, but if there's folks in the room that number in the double figures, that's a pretty good sign. Usually, in the first year, I kind of characterize those folks as the pioneers, and in any kind of project, a lot of folks don't want to be the first ones in and doing all that hard work up front to organize a garden and get it in place. But there are some people that really love that piece of new projects, and so if I have in the first organizing meeting around a garden, or if we have something in the order of 10 to 20 folks, that's an awfully good sign that you have a critical mass of people who are committed to the project. Because typically after the first year, and you've gotten the garden planned and organized, and maybe you got the basic infrastructure in place, and people are gardening, and a season has gone by, then there's a second wave of people that come into the garden that usually doubles that first number and then some. And then, at least what we've experienced here in Denver, there tends to be a waiting list after the second or third year. And that's kind of a good thing. You want to have a waiting list so that folks that leave the garden that need to, they get moved for work, it turns out to be too much for them, some life circumstance change, then you've got someone right in the wings to step into their plot. And a successful garden is a full garden. So that critical mass, if I entered a room and there was 6 to 10 people, I'd still feel pretty comfortable unless it was going to be a very large garden. But somewhere around double figures is a really good open gut feeling for us that there is a broad base of interest and a critical mass of folks who already want a garden. Right, and that's a good point. That it's not just a group of people from the same point of view that want a garden, from one building or something like that, that you have a broad base of folks that are showing up from the nearby school, from several neighborhoods that are adjacent. It's always wonderful to see a city councilman show up in the initial meeting, or someone from the city council office. And then potentially people that have different skills so that you can already develop some leadership committee, folks that are good organizers and maybe doers in the room, and then you can build from there.
All right, we have another question from Julie Kuhn in Pueblo. She is working with many of the schools now in Pueblo, but has not researched the master plans for the schools. Would you suggest that she do that now after the fact?
Absolutely. It's better to know and deal with it than to have to deal with it in a crisis situation where, school districts are very busy doing what they're doing with very limited resources and limited staff, and they're focused on often the building on the school grounds and the needs of an expanding population or a shrinking population, and the educational performances of the school. And so the overall master plan of the property and the use of that property sometimes is a secondary thing to the folks in the administration of the school. Not necessarily to the teachers or the parent group or the kids, but there is definitely a focus on the facilities. And so to bring the point up now would be a very good thing to do, just so that you know that where you've located the garden is a safe place, or whether it's vulnerable from some standpoint. And of course, you got to get a planner in the room, and you've got to get the facilities person from the existing site, the principal, and maybe somebody from the plumbing department. But planning department is the most important, in that they know the ebb and flow of the district. They know whether they're going to have to add some buildings to the site to accommodate a growing population of students. They know whether they have a problem with drainage, whether they have a need to add parking spaces for the teachers. It would be in your best interest to have those meetings, even though you might be concerned about what you might find out.
And Julie, this is Shannon. One other thing, this could be a great opportunity if you don't already have a relationship with facilities to start that relationship, because if they're involved at the beginning, it will be easier to have buy-in at district level if they're part of the planning process the whole way.
Yeah, we've experienced that bringing them in as a partner instead of sort of the enemy is a good way to go, because they feel involved and they start to care about the garden, and it's not just someone that's kind of a squatter on their property that they feel comfortable moving around or telling them, sorry, you never got our permission. All of those issues go away if you involve them up front.
All right, we have another question, and this one is from, and my apologies if I'm butchering your name, Michaela Truslove. How do you ensure that gardens remain inclusive, and like you said, you don't just get a small group of people with one point of view? I imagine that this is important, especially at startup when guidelines are being created.
Right. Well, there's no substitute for the initial pioneers going out within their community to find out who else is nearby, if there's agencies or organizations that would be interested without sort of asking. And so that can happen kind of on a, through people's personal networks. It can be through the neighborhood association, in newsletters, flyers. There's really no substitute for sort of doing that outreach and research to figure out who is in your community around that garden that could actually provide some resources, might be interested in participating, might be a great asset to connect to, and doing that up front before you set guidelines to make sure that everybody's kind of at the table that shows interest in the garden. And then, if you make that up front a really important goal of the garden, that it's an inclusive place, and gardens that are inclusive are the most successful, then you can make sure that the committee is not running with, a committee of exclusive type folks is not running with the ball and not involving other folks. So that leadership, setting up that leadership steering committee is really important. We tend to keep the initial pioneers involved in the first set of meetings, just so that all interests and ideas get on the table, but then we're looking for a leadership steering committee to step forward that will do the business of the garden for the first several years, and to figure out the makeup of that committee is really important. And as an organization, we'll suggest the makeup based on the participant profile, but often you get volunteers, and sometimes you have to suggest others to make sure there's some involvement. That we have. Yeah. So we have, again, a set of sample guidelines that gardens can start with, and we'd be happy to provide that. And we're going to be providing that as part of our best management practice manual that will be coming out late winter, early spring, and will be available on our website and on the LiveWell website as well. And that set of best management practices will also have a sample approach to developing a steering committee and addressing that inclusive issue.
And one thing to add to that, this is Shannon. If you're sitting around and with your pioneers and you're planning, I think it's important to look at not only who is there, but who is not there, and maybe brainstorm as a group who would need to be included in order to make sure that the garden is as open and inviting as possible.
We have another question from Sean Clark. Do you have any experience with workplace gardens? Any guidelines you can give?
Well, we have yet to build one of these. We have been in the room talking with folks about. Shannon is, of course, going to jot down that we have built one. My memory's, fading. But there's a difficulty in setting up a workplace garden in that, and this is just our experience and our feeling about it, is that a garden and folks' workplace is going to get neglected potentially. Folks are very busy at their workplace. It's a wonderful idea, and it sounds really good to folks, and folks in the workplace will say, yeah, I'd love to go out there during my lunch hour or before I get to work or on my way out and do my work in the garden. And it might work that way, but the difficulty we've seen in the caution we give on this topic is that if it's only folks from the workplace, that garden is likely to get neglected. If it's engaging neighbors as well as folks from the workplace, then it has potential to succeed, and high potential to succeed. But it's the caution we've always given on this, and when we've had these meetings, folks have really looked at the concept internally after they've had this discussion with us, and have hesitated when they ask folks, really, are you going to garden there? Folks are awfully overworked, and it's hard to make that shift when they know that they've still got some work up on their table. So I guess our message on that is a cautionary one, and if you were to, if the situation was right, we would definitely recommend that you connect with neighbors as well to make sure that garden is cared for more than just during the workday.
Julie, we saw that you made a comment about what you're doing at the health department. Would you be interested in commenting over the phone and telling us about it? If so, if you can go ahead and raise your hand. I noticed that you're just logged in on your computer. I can try to see if you're able to talk. All right, Julie, you're unmuted. Why don't you go ahead and try to talk? We'll see if it'll work. All right, it looks like we're having a little bit of technical difficulty, so I'm just going to go ahead and read what Julie submitted, that we are doing one at the health department, and so far it has worked, but we are only doing veggies and containers on the patio. I took a consensus to see who would want to be involved. We split up the watering time.
That's kind of following a standard rule of thumb that we have, that that in some ways making sure that the garden is physically meeting the needs of the population it's serving without more work than folks can handle is a really important way to look at it. Often we do have a similar situation with some of our senior housing projects where we have a garden on the ground that's fairly diminutive, that's handling folks that still have that capacity to garden even in raised beds. But then we also are working with CSU Cooperative Extension, helping folks that don't have that physical capacity work some pots on one of their balconies as a group. So, the sort of notion of not biting off more than you can chew is a really good one for community gardens. So we try and size gardens to the communities and the community's needs with potentially some ability to expand, but also we don't want to have gardens be too big for the population because then they become hard to take care of and then they suffer.
All right, any more questions? Oh, great. Julie just added, we just purchased some self-watering containers to get us through the weekend.
There you go. There's a solution. And it also points to one of the other cautions that we have that might be counterintuitive around community gardens, and that one thing folks are always thinking about, typically, when they're starting up a community garden is, let's get a drip system in place and let's automate our water system. In this case, it makes sense because it's a workplace, and that's the one time of the week that no one's going to be there potentially. And so having an automated system over the weekend, keeps the garden from languishing. But most community gardens, we suggest not to have folks automate their water system because it works counterintuitive to the purpose of a garden, and that folks need to be together. And the times that they're together typically is when they're watering in the morning and in the evening, and when they're weeding when they're in the garden. And so if you're only leaving the work in the garden to the weeding, folks will put that off and not show up in the garden. And we have a garden that we didn't start, that we are aware of in Littleton, here in Denver that built all raised beds and automated the entire water system, and the garden struggles mightily because folks are never there. It's empty. So this is a caution that we want to make water systems that are very efficient and accessible to gardeners, but also that aren't so automated that folks choose not to show up in their busy lives, which is counter to the purpose of the garden.
This is Leslie. I have a question for Julie, if you can just type in the answer, about whether or not the health department allocated some of their hard funding for the gardens, or if you used some grant funds to purchase the different the containers and the self-watering system.
The health department actually allocated some funds, $500.
That's great. Thank you for sharing, Julie.
All right. We'll give it a few minutes for any last questions, or if there's any success stories that people would like to share similarly to Julie, please go ahead. All right. Well, if you do have any questions following this webinar, please go ahead and contact Leslie Levine at LiveWell, Colorado. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. Again, if you would like to review this webinar at a later date or share it with your colleagues, it will be available. Oh, we did have a last-minute question pop in. Has anyone put a garden into place in hospitals or nursing homes?
Not specifically here in Denver, but we do have a garden that's associated with a clinic up in the Globeville neighborhood of Denver. It's adjacent to Clinica Tepayec, and it's a solid developing partnership between the community garden, our organization, and the clinic. The notion is that the clinic uses the garden in some ways as modeling that healthy nutrition and a garden is a very positive thing to folks' health as they show up at the clinic for some sort of care. It's a very low-income, primarily Hispanic community, and so they're familiar for sure with gardening, but the notion of connecting it to health is a really important piece that the clinic is trying to get across. In fact, several plots will be gardened by some of the clinic staff in association with some of their patients. So that's probably the most direct connection we've made so far. And we also have an organization of young medical students that are interested in establishing a community garden on the Anschutz campus here in Denver, out in Aurora, in which a lot of healthy behavior can be modeled, and the students can connect that to some clinical work that they might do, some testing that they might do with folks. They've already established a farmer's market on the campus, and so the garden is the next logical piece. Again, making sure that the community members, the garden's in a location where community members could garden in that space is really essential, given that that's often the most overworked workplace, a health facility. Oh, not that one? Oh, yeah. We have a garden that that is adjacent to St. Joseph's Hospital. It's associated with a senior high-rise, and we lucked out in that during their redevelopment of their property, the hospital I'm speaking of, Exempla specifically, they were having to run a road right over the top of the garden and are now going to relocate the garden into the central location in their entry open space and connect it to the neighborhood in that way, in addition to providing space for the seniors in this adjacent building. And so I guess it speaks to the fact that there's plenty of health professionals that see the benefit of gardens and see them as a very tangible way to connect folks to healthier behavior. And as I mentioned earlier, the whole notion of a nursing home, a garden on a nursing home, we do have gardens on properties, at least a half a dozen of them, that are assisted living properties. We have to build raised beds, and we try and connect volunteers to the programming aspect of the gardens and volunteers to support the seniors in those activities. But I think research has shown that it is a really great way to keep folks active, to keep folks connected and out of isolation. In fact, a lot of our school gardens, we work with seniors in the community to connect kids to seniors and the benefit that goes along with that intergenerational work, but also it affects the seniors' health in that it slows their decline.
This is Leslie. I will add, I'm 99% positive that in Lamar, Colorado, which is part of LiveWell Prowers County, that they have cited their community garden on hospital property. So Cindy, if you want to connect with Emily, the coordinator for LiveWell Prowers County, I can do that. Just email me separately.
You know, there's plenty of benefits to that kind of thing where the community garden is on the property. Folks could be donating directly to the food system in that housing. They could provide a space for folks to be able to come out and just be in the garden. That is a huge benefit to folks in an assisted living situation. We have a garden that, in fact, wants to expand up in Lakewood that's on an assisted living and housing facility, that because so many of the folks have decided that this is the best way for them to connect socially to the other residents in their building, and they get hooked on the gardening piece of it because they're doing it together. Just as I mentioned earlier, though, this tends to be a special population in that you definitely have to have folks on the ground that are supportive from a programmatic standpoint, potentially from an organizing standpoint. You know, whoever the agency is that's supporting that facility, it's really beneficial to have folks locally there connected so that they're working the garden into the life of that building.
And Julie has also added that Craig Hospital has raised beds, and she also suggests researching the American Horticultural Therapy Association in Denver to locate other gardens tied to hospitals.
You know, that my last point about that topic, the garden I mentioned up in Globeville that's connected to the clinic has also got a connection to a nearby facility that supports young adults with emotional and mental difficulties. And the hort therapy piece of a garden is remarkable in how it changes those young people. I've watched it myself, in which a young man was not even, there was no way to control him until he got into the garden. And his job they gave him was to chop compost, and that compost became his thing, and he loved it. Hours on end, chopping compost. And the folks that worked with him said it changed him.
Well, unless there's any other questions that pop in the next few seconds, I'd like to thank you all for joining us this morning, and here's another one. From Lisa Harner, when working with a clinic or a health resource, do you look at critical mass of health resource or surrounding area neighborhood, or both? Sounds like looking at mini connectors. Have you used focus groups to assess critical mass?
We're not that sophisticated, but I would agree that would be a great way to go about it, to make sure that it's definitely an education process even with the health professionals in a setting like that, so that they truly understand the purpose of the garden, what their role would be, and how much work it takes, and how often the work isn't just digging in the ground. It's all that connecting work and all that the social work and organizing that sometimes takes up a lot of time, and in those kind of gardens would take up more time than a typical garden to make sure that it was successful. So I would take an approach where you would assess the capacity of both the community and the health professionals in a facility like that. And don't get fooled by students, by the way. Students and young interns, and we have an organization here in Denver called Branch that is a wonderful group of medical students out of the Anschutz campus with incredibly motivated to sort of change the approach to the work that they do and to work in a lot of this sort of proactive health promoting direction for patients and clients. And when they talk about all that they want to see happen, then the next thing you know, they're stuck in finals or they disappear. So I would caution you around having it solely be driven by students.
Great. Any last questions? All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. And as I mentioned before, this webinar will be available on LiveWell Colorado's website and on Denver Urban Gardens tomorrow. And everyone have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you for joining us.